Welcome to the Let's Learn to Fly podcast. I am Dr. Heather Monty, your host, flight instructor, and passionate educator. In each episode, we will explore different aspects of the world of aviation to introduce you to new possibilities and inspire you to let your dreams take flight. Hi there. Before we get started in today's episode, I wanted to add this quick disclaimer. I'm not a financial advisor, and this is not financial advice. I'm someone with many, many years of experience in higher education and helping people pay for the education needed to make their dreams come true. I also have my own experience getting screwed over by a flight school, and I want to make sure the same thing doesn't happen to you. So let's enjoy this episode. Hello, and welcome back to the Let's Learn to Fly podcast. I'm Heather Monty, your host for this podcast, and today we're going to talk about some tips and tricks for financing your flight training. So that is a common question that I get is how the heck do I pay for this? This is an expensive hobby. It's an expensive career choice. How am I going to pay for it? And I got the idea for this podcast over the weekend. I was actually speaking to a young man who is entering college this spring, and he's got his whole life planned out. He's going to go to school for pre-law. He's going to become an attorney. And he also wants to get his private pilot license while he's in college. And so that just sort of spun off this whole conversation about how to pay for your flight training. I think that there are some differences if you're pursuing this as a career versus a hobby. And so what I wanted to do is make this episode to share sort of my thoughts, my opinions based on my extensive experience working in higher education, my time in aviation as well, and just share with you some of the things that I know and have learned over the years. Now, it is important to know I'm sharing from my own personal experience with some of these things. I do not work for a flight school. I have my own ground school. So it's important for me to share that with you because I don't work for a flight school that's trying to get your business. And not to say that, all flight schools are bad or that's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that flight schools are a business, and they're going to help you find ways to pay for your flight training in any way that they can. And sometimes that can mean taking on debt. And I just feel like there are some other things that you can do before taking on debt. So I wanted to talk you through some of the things that I have learned over the years, the pieces of advice that I give to people as they're trying to figure out how to finance their flight training. So if you've ever dreamed about becoming a private pilot, a commercial pilot, either for a hobby or a career, you know that the cost of flight training can easily be prohibitive to accomplishing your goals. But you don't need to let that expense stop you from achieving your goal. So let's talk about some tips and tricks for financing your flight training. And then we'll also talk about a few ideas that I have on how to reduce the overall cost of your training. So if you're eager to start flying, let's go. The first thing that I think is extremely important is to do your research. Look at all your different options for flight training. There are different types of schools. There are different types of programs. You can get flight training at your local, what's called a fixed base operator, or FBO. They're generally on just about every airport. They're where you go to get gas for your airplane. And a lot of them do have flight training options. So you can research there. Those are going to be a little bit more flexible with regards to the timing and the schedules that it takes for you to get your pilot's license. And then there are also probably not as many opportunities for financing, but there are some options for financing there. But you want to make sure that you're doing research on all the different types of schools that there are out there and find something that fits your schedule, your flexibility, your other commitments. If you have a full-time job, you have other responsibilities outside of your work, such as a family, a home, a mortgage, all that stuff. Choosing an intensive, 40-hour-a-week flight training program probably isn't going to be the best for you. So you want to make sure that you're doing the research on all the different schools that there are out there. I always suggest get online, look in the particular area of the country and where you want to do flight training, and just start making a spreadsheet. Start doing a pros and cons list of each of them and just try to figure out what might be the best for you. If you're brand new to this, you might not know what is the best for you. And that's what my hope is with this podcast, is to help guide you through some of that process. So you also want to make sure that you take your budget into consideration. We're going to talk about this a lot more in the podcast, but you want to make sure that you understand exactly how much you can afford to spend on flight training. I often tell people when they're considering getting their private pilot certificate, I often tell them it's about like getting a used car. You want to make sure that you are able to afford to spend anywhere probably between $10,000 and $15,000 on getting your private pilot certificate. So make sure that you're okay being able to spend that amount of money on your flight training. And you want to make sure that whatever school that you choose, either they offer a variety of courses and programs, or understand what type of program they have so that you can find the right one for you. Like I said earlier, there are some schools out there, they specialize in getting you in and getting you out as quickly as possible. Probably not going to work for you if you have a full-time job or you can't take time off of work. I did that with my flight instructor certificate. I took some time off of work and went and just cranked it out and got it done. But that doesn't always work for everybody. So there are options where you can sort of fly as you go, but there are cons to that as well. You also can ask around, see if anybody you know has any good recommendations for flight schools. I get asked this question frequently. A lot of people are just looking for some guidance on how to even find a flight school. Like I said, most airports will have a fixed base operator and have some sort of flight training operation out of that. Some are better than others. Some are more of a business versus something that somebody sort of just does on the side. It's different. And again, it's all just going to depend on what it is that you're looking for. You also want to make sure you look at the school's website, make sure you review its policies and procedures, make sure you're okay with them. And then you can schedule a tour with the school. You can schedule what's called a discovery flight. You can go and get a 1-hour lesson with a flight instructor. Generally, it's going to be about 30 minutes on the ground, learning about the airplane, learning, just how the airplane works, how to do the pre-flight. And then you'll do about 30 minutes in the air. So you can do that. If you've already done a discovery flight, you can certainly just go around and schedule tours at all these different schools and just go and talk to them. You don't necessarily always have to do a discovery flight at each one of them. So make sure you're researching your options. So before you're even trying to figure out how the heck am I going to pay for this, you're making sure that you understand the different types of schools that are out there and start trying to figure out what is going to be the best flight school for you. From there, you want to make sure that you start calculating the cost of the flight training and other associated factors. So you want to take into consideration that you're going to need to pay for the airplane. You're going to need to pay for the flight instructor. Most airplane rentals are what's called wet fuel, which includes the cost of fuel, or it's a wet rental. And then there's the dry rentals, they do not include the cost of the fuel. You can also find different flying clubs that are out there that they may have an opportunity for you to rent a airplane as part of their flying club, but most of the time you need to buy into the flying club. And again, look at the cost, wet fuel versus dry fuel, or wet rental versus dry rental. There's going to be other costs associated with your flight training. There's going to be things like you need to buy headsets if you buy an iPad, if you get a 4-flight subscription, you buy a flight bag, there's all sorts of different stuff. Some of these things are one-time costs. Some of these things are costs that just keep incurring them. Things like maybe insurance, actually the aircraft rental itself. You also want to take a look at what kind of training materials you want to get for your ground school training. So if you haven't listened to my episode on what it takes to become a private pilot, I've got a separate episode about that. But in your flight training, you will prepare for a written, an oral, and then a flight test. And so you're going to need to do some preparations for all 3 of those tests. And some people do like to purchase ground school courses or other training programs to help them prepare for the written and the oral exam. So you want to factor that into that as well. You're going to want to also think about the pacing of your flight training and how that is going to influence the cost. So for example, I always like to sort of compare it to going to the gym. If you're only going to the gym once a week and you're dieting, you're trying to do some diet and trying to get in shape, it's going to take you a lot longer to get in shape as opposed to if you're going to the gym 3 or 4 times a week. If you're training for an event, you're training for something a race, a marathon, a 5K, whatever. If you're only training once a week, it's going to take you much longer to accomplish your goal versus training 3, 4, 5 times a week. And a lot of it has to do with it's the law of primacy. It's just you remember things. You don't have to continually review them as you come back to your follow-up lessons. Oftentimes, if you have 2 or 3 weeks in between your lessons, you need to review all the things that you did in the previous lesson. You spend a lot of time doing that, so you're paying your instructor for all of that. So if you can go 3 or 4 or 5 times a week, it's going to be much quicker and less number of hours versus if you spread it out over 2 or even 3 years. So you'll spend more time and more money if you are only doing training, once a week, twice a week, once every other week, whatever. One thing I always suggest is if you are getting your private pilot certificate as a hobby, if you're doing this as a hobby, save up the money to cover the cost of flight training, even if it's at half. All right. So if you figure you're going to spend $12,000 on getting your private pilot's license, save up $6,000. Okay. And then you can do that much more frequently versus you're just trying to, put some money towards it every paycheck. You've got that money there that you can start cranking out your training. All right. And the reason I say this is if you are doing this as a hobby is to save up the money is because I understand that oftentimes people, as they're trying to pursue a career, I was a dean at a university, I was a vice president in a college. I get that people have to finance their education in order to prepare for a career. So in some cases that would certainly be okay. But what I'm saying is if you are doing this as a hobby, save up the money. And that's what I told the young man that I spoke to over the weekend. I said, you're already going to graduate college with debt from law school. You're probably not going to pay for that out of pocket. The last thing you want is another 10 or 15 grand tacked onto that debt because you got your pilot's license. So if you're going to do this as a hobby, save up the money to cover the cost of the flight training, at least 50% of it, save it up over the time. It'll be less of a burden on you financially. Then once you've got that saved up and you're starting to do your flight training, make a budget, stick to it, and then you can reach your goal much quicker. And even doing simple things like cutting back on unnecessary expenses, put that extra money towards your savings for flight school, for flight training. And then you can even find creative ways to make more money, such as taking on extra jobs, selling unwanted items. I'd say that with a grain of salt, though, because that can cut into the time that you should be spending on your studies, actually doing flight lessons, preparing for your written exam, preparing for your oral exam. So you've really got to take your own schedule and your own unique experience into consideration there. My next suggestion is this: do not buy blocks of flight time up front. Some schools will give you a discount if you purchase, say, 10 hours or 15 hours. I know my yoga studio does this, right? I can prepay for 10 yoga classes, and I end up getting yoga classes for $12 a class instead of $17 a class. So I'm saving money because I'm prepaying for my yoga classes. But you know what happens if my yoga studio closes up shop? I'm probably out of that money. So if I've purchased 10 yoga classes and I've only used 3 of them, I'm out the rest of that money. If that school files bankruptcy, if they just close up shop, you may not get that money back. So that same thing happens here in with flight training, is that you need to be in control of your money. So just keep that money in a savings account and just pay as you go. You've got the money saved up, pay as you go. You've got more control over your finances, and keep in control of that. Don't just fork over $8,000. And I have a story about that I'll probably share in a later episode, but I was out $8,000 once because I did this. So this is why I'm very adamant about not buying up blocks of flight time. And I will post about this all over the place on social media too, because I'm really trying to prevent this from happening to other people. So be mindful of how much flight time you're using so you don't get caught off guard by the cost. Make sure that when you are actually doing your flight training, that you're not just going up and flying around, that you're actually, conducting a lesson, that you're getting something out of it, so that it's not just, somebody going up and just flying around for the heck of it. Some schools, like I said, they also offer discounts or payment plans. I know some schools, what they will do is they'll allow you to open up an account, and then at the end of the month, you just pay it off. Oftentimes you have to put a credit card on file. We'll talk about credit cards in a second here, but Oftentimes you'll have to put a credit card on file, and then at the end of the month, they'll just bill your credit card once. It actually helps them. It probably helps save on credit card charges and that kind of stuff. But some schools will allow you to do that as well. You can try to negotiate. Sometimes I get asked this question. You can try to negotiate with the flight school on the price of training. Some schools, they're really strict and saying, yes, this is what this costs. You have to remember the cost of actually operating an airplane is a fixed cost. You're not really going to change that cost. The school's not making a heck of a lot of money on you actually renting that airplane. So you may be able to negotiate with your flight instructor on his or her hourly rate, but keep in mind they are a professional. They have gone through a lot of training in order to be able to charge what they do charge for their services. Where you may get a discount is if you purchase something in a block, saying, okay, if I purchase 5 hours of training or 10 hours of training, they may give you a discount. But again, same thing applies to the flight school. And my last point here is just don't let flight schools walk away with your money. Just don't let them, please don't. I will tell you the story in another episode, but don't be like me. Next you can do is apply for scholarships or grants to help pay for flight training. There's a lot of different scholarships and grants out there that you can use to help pay for your flight training. You can go to a lot of different organizations, Women in Aviation, the 99s. If you go to this website, it's Aviation Scholarships. I've got the link for you in the show notes. What they've done is they've just sort of curated a list of all of the different aviation scholarships out there. One thing to take into note is that just because a scholarship might be run through Women in Aviation or the 99s or some other organization, doesn't mean it's just limited to women. That they do have scholarships that are open to anyone as long as you meet the requirements. Some of them, like I was just looking through some of them, and some are like you have to be interested in a job as an Alaskan bush pilot, or you have to be interested in going to work for Delta on this particular airplane, right? So they do have scholarships available to help you pay for your flight training. So you're going to want to do your research. This takes time. This can really be a part-time job. So you start spreadsheets of who you applied and how much you applied for. Figure out which ones you're eligible for. Figure out what the deadlines are. Some of them maybe had a deadline, maybe that you just missed. Put it on a spreadsheet so you remember next year to go look for it. And make sure that you are keeping track of all of the opportunities that are out there. You also want to make sure that you meet all the requirements, follow those instructions very carefully so that you can make it very easy for the people that are reviewing your scholarships to determine whether or not you qualify for that scholarship. And don't wait till the last minute to apply for those scholarships. Sometimes some scholarships, they're awarded as the scholarship applications come out. Some scholarships, they wait until a particular deadline and then they start reviewing scholarships. So make sure that you know how that works. And if you don't know, just make sure you apply early for that. Another really creative way to help pay for your flight training is to get a job at the flight school. That can help offset the cost of training. You can either work there as a flight instructor once you become a certified flight instructor. There's additional ratings to get beyond your CFI, your certificated flight instructor. You could either work there as a flight instructor once you get your CFI, or if you don't have that, you can work there in another capacity. So one example would be when I was young, way back in the day, I worked at my local airport doing line service. I fueled airplanes, I serviced airplanes, I greeted pilots as they were coming in, just made sure that they were good to go. They had everything they needed, and really just got to know a ton of awesome people in the aviation industry. What was really cool about this, the flight school didn't offer a discount, but what it did offer was the opportunity to meet a lot of really great people. I met people with airplanes. They would take me flying, show me around a little bit, introduce me more to the aviation industry, and made a lot of really good connections there. One thing you have to remember, though, is that airports are open 24/7. So you may have to work long hours, weekends, holidays, just depending on the role. If you're a receptionist at the front desk, you're probably not there at 3 a.m. But just keep in mind that whatever role you do try to get at the airport, you may be working long hours, weekends, holidays, that kind of stuff. The next thing I want to talk about is debt and going into debt to finance your flight training. Now, when I talk about how to pay for flight training, I talk about this in two different ways, and I've mentioned this before. There are people that want to get their pilot's license as a hobby, and then there's people that want to get their pilot's license because they want to pursue additional advanced ratings as a career so that they can make aviation their career. All right. Now, just for some context, I spent a long time of my career, 20 years in education, about 15, 16 years in higher education. I understand the student loan industry. I understand the student loan crisis. I understand what's going on and what's wrong with how we do student loans. Okay. So I'm telling you this because I want you to understand how student loans work at a very high level. This is not going to be a podcast about how student loans work, but this is just some information for you from my experience as a dean, as a vice president at a university, just helping you understand how student loans work. Okay. So you can get a couple different kinds of loans. We got the student loans, then we've got private loans. So you either type of loan, student loan or private loan, you need to be able to understand the terms and conditions of the loan before you sign anything. Make sure you know what your interest rate is, what the total amount of money you're going to end up paying back over time, when your first payment is going to come due. That's one major difference between student loans and private loans. The student loans are typically deferred while you're in school, and you have a grace period after you graduate and before you have to actually start paying back your student loans. Private loans, private lenders, they want their money starting to come back in right away. So you may take out a private loan and have to start making that payment right away next month. Okay, so even while you're still doing your flight training. So this is why I say this is very important to know that are you doing this as a career? Are you doing this as a hobby? If you're doing this as a career, understand a lot of people need to finance their education for their career. But my personal opinion is don't finance your hobby. Just don't finance it. Save up the money and make it happen. Okay. So student loans, one big difference between student loans and private loans is student loans are typically deferred while you are in school. Okay. And you have to be in school full time. There's certain criteria that you need to make. You need to make certain grades. You have to have a certain pace of completion, which means you have to actually be moving through your program. You can't keep failing classes. You can't keep withdrawing them. The government's not going to keep lending you money if you're failing and withdrawing your classes all the time. Student loan interest rates typically is lower than other types of loans. And again, you don't have to start repaying your student loans until after you graduate. Private loans, again, they're going to be loans that you probably are going to have to start paying back right away. Make sure you read those terms and conditions. They're generally going to be a little bit more expensive than student loans. The interest rate can also be variable, which means it can go up and down. So your payments might change based on what that interest rate might be. You might actually have to start repaying your loan while you're in school. So if you're going to school full time for getting all of your pilot ratings, are you working so that you can make those payments while you're in school? And private loans, you might have to get a cosigner. There's no collateral with a private loan. There's nothing that the lender can come and say, you didn't pay back your loan. We're going to take this back from you, right? So you might have to get a cosigner for your loan, and then just be aware of any fees. Read all of the fine print. So again, I'm not a banker. I'm not a lender. I'm not a financial expert. What I do know is just how student loans work, how private loans work to finance education. Have some experience there. So please don't take this as financial advice, okay? And now let's talk about credit cards. So some people will use credit cards to finance their flight training. They might find a low interest rate credit card. But the problem can be is that maybe that interest rate is low for 6 months or a year, something like that. But then after that, they tack on the interest, but then they tack on all the interest from that time that they had no interest or 1% interest. If you don't pay that balance off, they tack on that interest. So same thing with student loans. You want to make sure that you read the terms and conditions. You understand what the interest rate you're paying is. That can add up very quickly. So, and you don't want to necessarily carry that balance, especially if it's hits a certain point in time where they're going to back charge you all of that interest. So interest rates are going to be higher than loans, generally speaking. So, which means you're going to end up paying more in the long run, especially if you're only paying them the minimum payment rate or payment amount. You'll end up paying more in the long run. And really just use credit cards if you're confident you've got something coming in, you know that there's something happening that you can pay this off quickly. Make sure you're aware of any fees associated with the credit cards. There might be annual fees, late payment fees, stuff like that. And then make sure you make your payments on time. You don't want to damage your credit score. Credit cards are, if you make a late payment, that can certainly damage your credit score. So again, I am not a financial expert. I have experience in education, higher education, and my own experience with getting screwed over, paying for flight training. And I just wanted to share with you some of my tips, tricks, thoughts, ideas as a flight instructor, as a professional educator, how to finance your flight training. So my biggest tip to you is to do your research, explore all of your options, and find the best way for you. And with a little planning and effort, you can certainly make your dream of becoming a pilot a reality. All right. So again, this episode is really just some general guidance for you. Your individual situation's going to vary. Everybody who's listening to this episode, your individual situation's going to vary. So that's why you really need to do your due diligence, look at all sides, and figure out what is the best for you and your future. And finally, make sure you grab a free copy of my guide that answers 61 of your most frequently asked questions about how to become a pilot. It also includes those questions that you don't know yet to ask. So if you're brand new to this, you're brand new to this world, and you're not quite even sure what to even ask, I put together this guide, answers 61 of your 61 of your most frequently asked questions about how to become a pilot. So you can go to letsflyaz.com/private pilot FAQs, a free guide, or you can go to letsflyaz.com. There's a link right there. You can click on it and enter your email, and it will be downloaded right to your computer. Take a look at it. Let me know what you think of it. I also want to know, are there questions on there that I didn't answer? Because I will add them, and maybe we'll make it 62, 63, 64, all that stuff. So all right, well, thank you for joining me in this episode. I hope that you got at least one nugget of information about how to pay for your flight training and how to make your dream of becoming a pilot a reality. Talk to you soon.